Welcome back to the channel. So if you're a Cannibal Corpse fan, you will no doubt have your favorite albums ranked from worst to best or from best to worst. You'll probably either be on the side of Chris Barnes era or Corpsegrinder era, and you might even have favorite album from the early trajectory featuring the Chris Barnes era. Obviously, we have Eaten Back to Life, followed up by Butchered at Birth, and then we have Tomb of the Mutilated, and then we have The Bleeding, which was released in 1994. And obviously, the entire trajectory of the Cannibal Corpse discography is pretty interesting because of that split that occurred in 1995 during the Created to Kill sessions, which eventually obviously became Vile. We actually got our Vile shirt on today, but we're not going to be discussing Vile. We're actually going to be discussing The Bleeding, a really interesting, shocking, evil, but catchy Cannibal Corpse album. So let's get into The Bleeding. I'm just going to kind of go off the cuff here and discuss the interesting, important details of The Bleeding, what I like about it, what I don't like about it, and the fact that it stands out to me in the early trajectory of Cannibal Corpse album as the most Chris Barnes-esque Cannibal Corpse album. Now, I have listened to the demo versions of Created to Kill. I think that would have been a really, really cool album as well. But I think as time goes on over the years, people have gained much more of an appreciation of the Chris Barnes era. Some people refuse to accept Corpsegrinder, and they've died on the Chris Barnes hill since Chris Barnes actually left the band. So obviously he's got some diehard fans. And I would say that when I first got into Cannibal Corpse, I was more of a Corpsegrinder fan. I guess because at that time, that's when they were making the most albums with Corpsegrinder when I was, in high school back in sort of the late 2000s or whatever. So maybe at the time I was partial to Corpsegrinder. I think he is a more powerful vocalist, but he's not necessarily a better vocalist, and he's not necessarily a better performer, if that makes sense. So in 1993, obviously Cannibal Corpse released Tomb of the Mutilated and recorded at More Sound Studios with Scott Burns. The album had a really heavy, cohesive sound. It actually sounded better than Butchered at Birth or obviously Eaten Back to Life. And the guys in Cannibal Corpse, that being the musicians and Chris Barnes, the vocalist, but primarily the musicians, wanted to really up their musicianship, really show their skills as guitar players, drummers, bass players. Alex Webster and Bob Rousay and Jack Owen, they really wanted to write really good technical death metal songs. But by the time we got to The Bleeding, they wanted to continue that ideology or that musicianship skill-wise, but they also wanted to write catchy songs. And The Bleeding is an interesting album in particular because of the fact that the songs are so darn catchy, but that does not take away or dispute the heaviness of the Cannibal Corpse sound on The Bleeding, and it certainly does not take away from the evil lyrical vibe and the eerie vibe on the vocals that Chris Barnes managed to produce on this album. And I would say that for the first four Cannibal Corpse albums, The Bleeding just has the most evil sounding sort of vibe and energy to it. And I think primarily it's because of Chris Barnes. I mean, obviously the music is really good. Musicianship is sound. It's skillful. The songs are tight. They're a little more catchy than stuff we had seen previously on other albums. But there is a certain maniacal, menacing, evil energy that comes across from Chris Barnes. Is not only his lyrics, but his vocals when he starts to do that really screechy sort of "I came back" sort of thing that he does on the Pickaxe Murders. And we had seen those sort of higher vocals from Chris Barnes a little bit on Tomb of the Mutilated, but particularly on The Bleeding is really when he went full throttle with sort of these evil, I would describe them as witchy, screeching zombie vocals. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. Everybody kind of pokes fun and makes fun of Chris Barnes' vocals, especially nowadays because his vocals have changed. That's sort of another argument, whether or not you like Chris Barnes, whether or not you hate his vocals, whether or not you like his dreadlocks. I really don't care. I've grown to sort of love Chris Barnes' vocals over the years, and I think unfortunately Cannibal Corpse gained perhaps a better vocalist and maybe / a better headbanging frontman with Corpsegrinder. Obviously, he's got a deeper, more full, more skilled, more technical death metal voice. But what they lost with Chris Barnes was that evil sort of mystique. that evil, those evil lyrics and that evil mystique and that evil sort of vibe that they had with Chris Barnes that cannot be replaced. Obviously, Chris Barnes went on to created the band called 6 Feet Under, and they've sort of carried that torch with the evil Chris Barnes vibe and the vocally and lyrically. But I think it's interesting when we discuss the Bleeding because tensions were arising around this time of the Bleeding, rewinding all the way back to Tomb of the Mutilated. And during the time of the Bleeding, it was just kind of a weird session, as Chris Barnes describes it. The band didn't really like what he was doing vocally, and I think Chris Barnes was starting to shock the other members of Cannibal Corpse with his lyrical content. And by the time we get to Created to Kill, and obviously what eventually evolved into Vile album, the band members wanted to actually write the songs lyrically and musically because they were writing them with their instruments. They figure, well, we're writing the songs, with the guitars and the bass and the drums. We want to have some input lyrically as well. So there was a transition there. There was a lot of tension between the Bleeding and obviously Created to Kill, and sadly Created to Kill never became a thing because Chris Barnes quit / was fired. But the album The Bleeding was recorded, as their previous albums were, in Morrisound Studios with Scott Burns. And Scott Burns was really pushing the band members to just make sure they're playing really well on the recordings, make sure their picking is really tight, make sure the drums are good. And Scott Burns was convinced that Cannibal Corpse could and would become, the next Death or the next Morbid Angel, not really realizing that the genre within death metal, yes, it's death metal, I get that, but Cannibal Corpse is sort of a different offshoot, sort of a different subgenre of death metal, that being gory, shocking death metal. The band Death with Chuck Schuldiner was more philosophical, technical prog metal. Morbid Angel was more of like an anti-religious sort of vibe. So every band from that early 90s death metal trajectory, that death metal landscape sort of formed into their own subgenre. And I think it's fascinating that Cannibal Corpse, held the torch for the brutal, shocking death metal that they created or started with, but they never gave up on that. They kept the gore, they kept the shock, they kept the blood. And it's really cool. But going back to the Bleeding a little bit, obviously we talked about some of the band tensions. Members of Cannibal Corpse that were around during this time, obviously Bob Rousset was fired in 1993, which Chris Barnes actually was not happy about, neither was Jack Owen, but Paul Mazurkiewicz and perhaps Alex Webster obviously wanted to bring a better guitar player on board because they felt Bob Rousset was kind of veering off into the wrong direction. He was a little sloppy, but he was a great performer. If you watch the Cannibal Corpse documentaries, you'll see that they appreciated his stage persona, and they even appreciated some of his songs that he wrote for Tomb of the Mutilated and Butchered at Birth and Eaten Back to Life, but they were sort of veering in a different direction technically, musician-wise, and they needed a guitar player that was going to be able to meet them up on that level. So, make a long story short, Bob Rousset is kicked out of the band, and they bring in Rob Barrett is brought in from guitar, to play guitar rather, and he fits really well with the new style of songs that they're writing for the Bleeding. But the recording sessions for the Bleeding are going fairly well musician-wise, but they don't really like that being the band members in Cannibal Corpse are not 100% happy with Chris Barnes' vocals. That is, Chris Barnes started to do the little witchy, screechy, squealy vocals. When I first heard it, I was like, what the heck is this? I wasn't even sure I liked it because it was so off-putting and eerie and creepy sounding. I was like, this sounds really bad. It sounds cheesy. But over the years, as I go back and listen to that album, I appreciate what Chris Barnes was doing. And in fact, I think it's an interesting vocal style, even though technically it's not maybe correct. It does have a certain vibe to it. It has a certain, what's the word I'm looking for? It has a certain appeal to it and a certain sound that no death metal vocalist has really done before or since. Now, obviously, we focused a lot primarily on the screechy, I came back, Chris Barnes lyrical style, or vocal style rather, but he obviously still does his really guttural stuff, but we can see him transitioning into sort of a different vocalist that we can even hear more on the Created to Kill demo sessions / never came to fruition album that eventually became the Vile record. And it's a really interesting vocal style. It's a really creepy vocal style. It fits really well with sort of this weird serial killer-esque psychopathic monster zombie character that Chris Barnes was sort of creating musically and vocally and lyrically with that started pretty much obviously from the early trajectory of Cannibal Corpse, but really came to fruition on Tomb of the Mutilated and the Bleeding. And I remember when I got the Bleeding, they didn't have at the time Tomb of the Mutilated. I went to that record store that they used to have at the malls. I can't even think of the name of it right now. But for some reason they had the Bleeding, so I picked up the Bleeding, not really knowing much about it, hadn't heard much about it. I thought the album art was a little bit different than some of the other Cannibal Corpse albums. I was a little disappointed because I wanted to go home and show everybody that I had Butchered at Birth or Tomb of the Mutilated or whatever, right? But I was looking for a shocking album cover too, and I didn't really quite find that with the Bleeding. But once I actually turned on the CD, the actual record of the Bleeding, I was like, this is a really strong, creepy, scary, evil, monstrous, horrifying Cannibal Corpse album. And I would say, like we said in the beginning of this video, out of the first 4 albums of Cannibal Corpse and the first 4 trajectory of the Chris Barnes albums, for me, I'm not going to say that the Bleeding is necessarily the best, but it is the most horrifying, the most evil Cannibal Corpse album. Yes, and I'll die on that hill because I really believe that, and I think, and I know for certain that it is because of Chris Barnes' vocals. There's something really eerie and really disturbing about that. And if you are familiar with the Cannibal Corpse lore, you'll know that they had some tensions, obviously musically and lyrically and studio-wise, with Chris Barnes versus Alex Webster and Paul Mazurkiewicz in particular. Bob Rousset was kicked out, obviously, and I think Rob Barrett was kind of just along for the ride, whether or not he necessarily was for or against Chris Barnes' lyrics or vocals remains to be seen. Maybe there's an article on that, let me know. The source of the tension seems to be Chris Barnes versus Paul Mazurkiewicz and Alex Webster. And obviously Rob Barrett wanted Paul Mazurkiewicz to play drums a little bit differently, so there were some tensions that occurred later on after Vile was recorded and Rob Barrett left the band. So typical band drama. But to make a long story short, and the reason I'm bringing up the musical tensions is because there were also some personal tensions that Alex Webster and Paul Mazurkiewicz have never really revealed. And I would tend to think that maybe it was because of Chris Barnes' marijuana habit, perhaps, or it was perhaps what he was into, the things that he gained inspiration from for his really macabre, creepy, serial killer-esque lyrics. And I'm not going to speculate on what that might have been, but there was obviously something that Chris Barnes was involved in or was interested in, or something that, some type of behavior or bad habit that he brought to the studio or the practice space that the other members of Cannibal Corpse just did not like. Now, like I said, Alex Webster and Paul Mazurkiewicz have never really revealed what that part of Chris Barnes' personality or history or psyche is. Like, even the documentary, Paul Mazurkiewicz says, there were some other things that were going on with Chris Barnes that I'm not going to get into, but so what is that? It's neither here nor there, but I think it's interesting, and I think if you get my gist, I believe it has something to do with the type of lyrics that Chris Barnes was writing. And even though Chris Barnes was their original vocalist, even though they were a death metal band, they wanted to be scary, they wanted to be horrifying, they were starting to become disturbed by their own vocalist lyrical direction. And obviously, if you're familiar with Cannibal Corpse, you'll know what they sing about. But Chris Barnes in particular really, really honed in on this. Some people say it's misogynist. To me, it does have misogynistic elements, but you have to separate the art from the artist. I don't think the misogynistic aspects of the early Cannibal Corpse lyrics, I don't think that makes any of the band members believe in what they're saying or makes them misogynist or any of that stuff, but that stuff definitely came up. Hell, even Angela from Arch Enemy said that she couldn't really get behind Cannibal Corpse, or at least the early albums, because of the misogynistic lyrics. And if whether or not you want to argue they're misogynistic or not, the point is that Chris Barnes really, really honed in on this, I guess we would say, heterosexual serial killer perspective, meaning sort of a male serial killer or a male perpetrator doing things, horrible things to the opposite gender. And Chris Barnes really, really honed in on this perspective mentally and maybe spiritually and lyrical wise and sort of cognitively. And we sort of get this really macabre, evil, creepy, eerie perspective from these really creepy, deranged people that Chris Barnes takes on the perspective of to write these really amazing death metal songs. Does that make Chris Barnes okay with what he's saying or singing? No, but he obviously was interested in some pretty twisted stuff to be able to write those lyrics. And, obviously he quoted Albert Fish on the Butchered at Birth album. You'll see that in the liner notes. You can obviously tell he did his homework. He was really interested in the subject. We can see where Chris Barnes was going with this. By the time we get to the Bleeding album, released in 1994, the other band members of Cannibal Corpse kind of started putting their foot down. Before I interrupt myself, the next quote that I'm going to reveal has never really fully been explained either, which is interesting, but Chris Barnes claims that the other members of Cannibal Corpse said in relation to Stripped and Strangled, if I can even say that on YouTube here, the other band members said, "You will never write another song like that again." And he never really revealed what they meant by that. Did he mean lyrically? Did he mean musically because it was too catchy? If we take the lyrics of that song I just mentioned, I'll put the name of the title on here. It obviously goes down in history as one of the most catchy, accessible Cannibal Corpse songs, sort of on a musical auditory level. Lyrically speaking, perhaps not, but everybody knows the opening riff. We can see that, obviously, like what I was saying before I interrupted myself, we can see the trajectory of where Chris Barnes was going. And he actually, by the time we get to 6 Feet Under, he kind of shifts gears and goes into a little bit of a less serious, maybe a little bit more goofy, Halloween-esque sort of direction with his vocals and sort of stage persona. But had he stayed in Cannibal Corpse, I think we would have gotten even deeper levels of insane, really, really disturbed lyrics that Chris Barnes was really starting to hone in on. And for some reason, like I said, the other band members started to get a little concerned, and I'm not really sure why. It's because based on the fact that they were a death metal band and they had been with Chris Barnes since the late 80s, why all of a sudden was this stuff becoming a problem? And I think a lot of it was because they wanted, not only did they not like the weird sort of zombie, freaky, witchy vocals that Chris Barnes was doing, the really high stuff that we see on all the songs on The Bleeding pretty much, but they wanted to change his lyrical direction, and they wanted to sort of explore other themes that weren't so narrow-minded, not just male serial killers. They wanted to do something a little more profound, and we see that on the Vile album. I mean, the cover of this album, if you look at the cover of the Vile album, you'll see that it's a man on the cover that has been brutalized and assaulted and abused. So obviously Cannibal Corpse was getting a little uncomfortable with this sort of male on female violence, I guess we would suggest, and they wanted to sort of expand their repertoire. And on the Vile album, we don't really see any songs about that sort of thing. We see like Mummified and Barbed Wire and being eaten by rats and dudes getting their genitals related and crazy stuff like that, and the Bloodlands, about this evil place that blood just rains all over you and stuff. So I think they wanted to sort of expand themselves sort of maybe on an intellectual lyrical level that they just were not able to do with Chris Barnes at that time, for better or worse. And Chris Barnes, was just very specific. Even on the DVDs and the interviews, he said that he did not really want to be told what to do. That's not why he got into a band. He wanted to express his thoughts and his feelings about things, not sing about somebody else's. And that kind of makes sense, but it's too bad that the personalities, that being mostly Paul Mazurkiewicz and Alex Webster versus Chris Barnes, could not gel to finish the Created to Kill album, because I think it's fascinating what that record would have been. And if you're not familiar with Created to Kill, it's a little sort of missing piece of Cannibal Corpse history that came in between the Bleeding and the Vile album, which was released in, I want to say 96. It could have been 95. I'm pretty sure it's 96. But the Created to Kill sessions took up most of 1995. And in comparison to the Bleeding, Created to Kill sessions was basically what imploded the band, because Chris Barnes and Paul Mazurkiewicz and Alex Webster just could not see eye to eye musically, lyrically, and sort of where they were going to get their inspiration from. And some of the hate and censorship that Cannibal Corpse had suffered from in the early 90s up until this time obviously only helped to elevate their position. If you ban something, it's just going to make all the adolescents and kids want to go out and buy that album. But I think the band was trying to, on some level, become more accessible, and they thought that kicking Chris Barnes out of the band and changing the lyrics, not having so many male on female violent lyrics would have maybe helped their trajectory. And I think in the long run, it has helped them become more accessible. They still sing all those old songs, you know, are still part of the Cannibal Corpse repertoire. And most people don't take them too seriously. But if you actually listen to those early Chris Barnes albums, you can't help be affected by that type of art that they were making at that time. And it really gets into your psyche. It really gets into your soul. And you really start to understand how disturbing it was. And that was partially why I wanted to make this about the bleeding, because it is such a disturbing Cannibal Corpse album. But yeah, leave your thoughts and comments and speculations below in the comment section. Let me know what those tensions might have been between Chris Barnes and Alex Webster and Paul Mazurkiewicz outside of what's already known. Why did they tell Chris Barnes that he'll never write another song like again? Why were they trying to censor Chris Barnes? What was Chris Barnes doing that disturbed the band so much? What was that friction that created the kill sessions to implode? You know, really great that we have those two eras of Cannibal Corpse. Perhaps in another future video we will maybe do a Cannibal Corpse ranking. Maybe we'll break it down from the Chris Barnes era to the Corpsegrinder era. Maybe eventually we can do like a Cannibal Corpse lore video. That would be really cool, discussing all the history and all the forgotten lore of Cannibal Corpse. But just to kind of get the wheels grinding again on the metal content, I wanted to sort of just introduce this Cannibal Corpse video to sort of speculate and sort of talk about my love for the Bleeding album and talk about why to me it's the most disturbing. And I think, like I said, it's not only the lyrical content, but it's the weird, eerie tritone notes that Cannibal Corpse used, but it's just the way that they wrote the songs. It's the way that the lyrics come across, and it's the way that the vocals from Chris Barnes come across. They sound like a literal evil serial killing zombie that you do not want to encounter. And we have themes of all kinds of macabre, violent themes of delving into the realm of necrophilia and assault on corpses and all kinds of really creepy stuff that Cannibal Corpse had sort of touched on before but never really went full throttle with. So let me know in the comment section below, what are your thoughts on the Bleeding? Do you think it stands out as the most evil Chris Barnes era Cannibal Corpse album? Perhaps the most evil Cannibal Corpse album that ever existed, apart from maybe Created to Kill, I think is a close second, but that's not a real official Cannibal Corpse album. And obviously some of the albums with Corpsegrinder are, I don't even want to say they're evil, because they're really not. They're more comical. And I think the way that Chris Barnes comes across versus the way that Corpsegrinder comes across, that's really what made Cannibal Corpse kind of scary and edgy and evil. And that's why the press wanted to talk to Chris Barnes, because he was this crazy dude with long hair in his face and his eyes were rolled up into his head. And he just had the microphone like this. And obviously, Corpsegrinder is perhaps a better vocalist, a better headbanger, a better performer. But Chris Barnes brought something more evil to the stage, more macabre and more sinister and more secretive. And he had more of like a persona that was interesting, apart from just some dude on stage headbanging that plays World of Warcraft like Corpsegrinder, you know. And obviously, most of us have never seen the Chris Barnes era live with Cannibal Corpse. That the closest thing you can get to that is 6 Feet Under. And I've definitely been stepping my toes further into 6 Feet Under over the past couple of years because of my appreciation for the early Cannibal Corpse albums. But thank you so much for watching. Please like and share this video. Check out the heavy metal commentary playlist. Check out all the recent uploads. We've been doing all kinds of different content on here. And we're not going to exclusively do heavy metal. We're going to just do whatever the heck I pretty much feel like making. But we are going to probably monthly do at least one heavy metal video. So I hope the metalheads will stick around for this new series that we're going to be introducing. We're going to be talking about death metal and black metal and thrash metal and all kinds of different things. So I hope you all enjoyed it. Hope you all are still along for the ride. Please follow me on Instagram at Andrew Marlowe Artist Official. Check out my other channel where we talk about books over on In-Depth Literature. And like I said, check out the playlist that we've curated for you. I would really appreciate it. Let me know your thoughts on Cannibal Corpse, which era is your favorite, and we will sort of continue this conversation in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all again very soon.